Victoria Osteen's smile froze mid-sentence as Jonathan Roumie spoke 6 words that would shatter the foundation of America's largest megachurch. The cameras captured everything: 16,000 people packed into Lakewood Church's arena, millions watching live online, all witnessing the moment when Prosperity Gospel's Queen met the man who portrayed Jesus himself. What started as a friendly interview about faith and Hollywood success turned into the most explosive confrontation modern Christianity had ever seen broadcast live. Victoria had prepared her talking points carefully, ready to steer the conversation toward Lakewood's signature message of blessings, victory, and living your best life now. But when Jonathan quietly revealed what Jesus had told him 3 weeks earlier about Victoria's secret struggle, something only her family knew, her confident demeanor crumbled completely. The megachurch pastor's wife sat speechless as Jonathan exposed the one truth that prosperity preachers spend their entire careers avoiding. And what happened next would trigger a spiritual earthquake that would shake American Christianity to its core. Welcome, everyone, to this very special Lakewood Sunday. Victoria's voice rang through the massive arena, her signature enthusiasm lighting up the stage. We have such an incredible guest with us today, the man who brings Jesus to life on screen for millions around the world. Please welcome Jonathan Roumie from The Chosen. The congregation erupted in applause as Jonathan walked onto the stage, his simple black shirt and silver cross necklace standing in stark contrast to the opulent production surrounding him. He smiled warmly, taking his seat beside Victoria on the pristine white furniture that had become iconic in prosperity gospel imagery. "Jonathan, we are just thrilled to have you here," Victoria continued, her perfectly styled appearance embodying everything Lakewood represented: success, polish, prosperity. The Chosen has broken every record imaginable. Over 600 million views. Tell our audience what it's like to portray the Son of God. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully, his demeanor humble despite the massive success Victoria referenced. "It's been the greatest privilege of my life, Victoria. But I have to be honest, playing Jesus has also been the most convicting experience I've ever had. Because the more I study his actual words in Scripture, the more I realize how different the real Jesus is from the version many American churches present." The statement hung in the air for a brief moment, subtle enough that most audience members didn't catch the implication. But Victoria did. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly as she redirected. "Well, we believe Jesus came to give us abundant life. John 10 verse 10. He came that we might have life and have it more abundantly. That's the Jesus we preach here at Lakewood." "Abundant life," Jonathan repeated slowly, his tone neutral but his eyes reflecting something deeper. "Victoria, can I ask you something? When Jesus spoke those words to poor fishermen who would eventually be tortured and martyred for their faith, what kind of abundance do you think he was promising them?" The question was gentle, but it landed like a bomb in prosperity gospel territory. What Jonathan said next would force Victoria to confront the one thing she'd been running from for months. But first, she would try to defend the empire built on promises that sound beautiful but crumble under the weight of real suffering. If you've ever questioned whether following Jesus guarantees earthly blessings, keep watching, because what's about to unfold will change everything you thought you knew about faith. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because this conversation is about to get real. Victoria's media training kicked in immediately, her smile never wavering as she prepared her rebuttal. "Jonathan, I think you're creating a false dichotomy here. Yes, the disciples faced persecution, but that was a different time, a different culture. Today, in America, we have religious freedom. We can experience God's blessings without the threat of martyrdom. Surely you don't think God wants his children to suffer when he has the power to bless us?" The audience murmured in agreement, comfortable with this familiar theology that had been reinforced week after week from this very stage. Jonathan remained quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words with care. "Victoria, I'm going to share something that might make you uncomfortable," he began, his voice still gentle but carrying unmistakable authority. "For the past 7 years, I've spent 8 to 10 hours a day studying the Gospels, not as an actor learning lines, but as a follower trying to understand who Jesus really is. And here's what I've discovered. Jesus never once promised his followers that faith would lead to material prosperity, perfect health, or comfortable lives. That's not, Victoria started to interrupt, but Jonathan raised his hand respectfully. Let me finish, please. Jesus told his followers they would be hated, persecuted, and killed for his name's sake. He said they'd have trouble in this world. He commanded them to take up their crosses daily, an instrument of execution, Victoria, not a symbol of blessing. He warned that following him would cost them everything, including family relationships and their own lives. These aren't obscure verses, they're central to his message. The atmosphere in the arena had shifted dramatically. What was supposed to be an uplifting celebrity interview had become a theological confrontation that no one expected. Victoria's smile had vanished entirely, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. But we have to give people hope, Jonathan, she protested, her voice rising slightly. People come to Lakewood broken, hurting, desperate. They need to hear that God loves them and wants to bless them. If we tell them that following Jesus means suffering and sacrifice, we'll drive them away from faith entirely. Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes filled with compassion rather than judgment. Or maybe we'll finally offer them something real, Victoria. Something that doesn't fall apart the moment life gets hard. Because here's what I've learned from reading thousands of testimonies from chosen viewers around the world. The prosperity gospel is creating spiritual casualties at a devastating rate. The cameras caught several audience members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the encouraging message they'd come to hear. What do you mean by that? Victoria asked, her defensive posture revealing that she knew exactly what he meant. I mean the single mother who claimed healing for her cancer with perfect faith, confessed prosperity over her situation, and still died, leaving her children wondering if God failed them or if they failed God. I mean the family that tithed faithfully, expecting financial breakthrough according to your teaching, and lost their home anyway. I mean the countless believers who've been taught that suffering means lack of faith, so when trials come, and Jesus promised they would, these people experience not just the trial itself, but crippling spiritual shame on top of it. Victoria's carefully constructed composure was cracking visibly now. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair, and Joel Osteen, watching from the front row with his trademark smile notably absent, looked increasingly uncomfortable. That's not fair, Victoria said, her voice trembling slightly. We're not telling people that bad things won't happen. We're giving them faith to overcome. No, Victoria. Jonathan's interruption was firm but not harsh. You're giving them false hope. You're teaching them that Jesus is a means to an end, a tool for getting the comfortable life they want, rather than teaching them that Jesus is the end, that knowing him is worth more than any earthly blessing, that his grace is sufficient even when he doesn't heal, doesn't prosper, doesn't make life easy. The silence in the arena was deafening. 16,000 people who had come expecting to feel good about themselves were instead confronting uncomfortable truths that their theology had no framework to address. Victoria stood abruptly from her chair, pacing a few steps before turning back to face Jonathan. You don't understand what we're trying to do here. We're reaching millions of people who would never step foot in a traditional church. We're making faith accessible, relevant, positive. Not everyone can handle the kind of intense, suffering-focused Christianity you're describing. I understand exactly what you're doing, Jonathan replied, standing as well to meet her eye level. You're making Christianity palatable by removing everything that makes it Christianity. You're preaching a Jesus who never told anyone to take up their cross. A Jesus who never warned about counting the cost. A Jesus who came to improve your life rather than to save your soul. The confrontation had reached a boiling point, but Victoria had one more card to play, a personal attack that would force Jonathan to reveal the prophetic message he'd received about her 3 weeks earlier. What she didn't know was that her challenge was about to backfire in the most devastating way possible. Keep watching to see how Jonathan's response exposes the hidden pain Victoria has been carrying for months, a pain that prosperity theology has left her completely unequipped to handle. Don't skip ahead, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will shock you. Victoria's eyes flashed with something between hurt and anger as she pointed directly at Jonathan. That's easy for you to say, isn't it? You're an actor. You play Jesus on TV, collect your paycheck, and then go back to your comfortable life in Los Angeles. When's the last time you actually suffered for your faith, Jonathan? When's the last time you faced real hardship that challenged everything you believe? The personal nature of the attack caused audible gasps throughout the congregation. This had gone far beyond theological discussion into something raw and confrontational. Joel started to stand from his seat, clearly considering whether to intervene, but something stopped him. Jonathan didn't flinch. Instead, his expression softened with such profound compassion that it visibly disarmed Victoria's aggression. "You're right that I haven't faced persecution like Christians in hostile nations," he acknowledged. "But suffering comes in many forms, Victoria. And I think you know that better than anyone in this room right now." Victoria's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" 3 weeks ago, Jonathan began, his voice gentle but unwavering, "I was in my prayer space in Los Angeles, praying about whether to accept your invitation to come here. I was conflicted because I knew our theological differences might create exactly this kind of confrontation. I didn't want to cause division or embarrass anyone publicly." The audience leaned forward collectively, sensing something significant was about to be revealed. "But as I prayed, I felt the Holy Spirit speak to my heart with unusual clarity. Not an audible voice, but an unmistakable spiritual impression. And the message was specifically about you, Victoria." Victoria's hands began to tremble slightly. "About me? The Lord showed me that you're carrying a burden that your theology can't help you bear. That you've been lying awake at night, questioning everything you've taught for 20 years, because your own life has confronted you with suffering that no amount of positive confession or claimed blessing can remove." The color drained completely from Victoria's face now. Several audience members who knew the family exchanged worried glances, clearly aware of something the general public wasn't. "How dare you?" Victoria started, but her voice broke. "Your mother has stage 4 cancer," Jonathan said quietly. "And despite everything you've taught about faith and healing, despite claiming breakthrough over her situation, despite doing everything your prosperity theology prescribes, she's not getting better. She's dying. And you don't understand why God isn't showing up the way you've promised others he would." The revelation sent shockwaves through the arena. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. The secret she and Joel had carefully kept from the public, protecting the Lakewood brand from any narrative that suggested faith might not guarantee healing, had just been exposed by someone who couldn't possibly have known. "How do you know that?" Victoria whispered, her voice barely picked up by the microphone. "We haven't told anyone outside immediate family. There's no way you could know that." Jonathan's eyes filled with tears of compassion. "Because Jesus knows, Victoria. He knows about the nights you can't sleep, lying in bed wondering if you've wasted 20 years teaching people a gospel that doesn't work when it's really tested. He knows about the conversation you had with your mother 2 weeks ago, when she told you she's found more peace in accepting her death than she ever found in all the years of claiming healing." Victoria's legs seemed to give out beneath her. She sank back into her chair, openly weeping now, no longer concerned about cameras or image or the thousands watching her carefully constructed persona crumble in real time. "She said something else, didn't she?" Jonathan continued, kneeling beside Victoria's chair. "She told you that knowing Jesus in the valley of death has been worth more than 1,000 days of the prosperity you've been preaching. She said she finally understands what Paul meant about the fellowship of his sufferings. And that terrified you, Victoria, because it dismantled everything you've built your ministry on." "Stop," Victoria sobbed. "Please stop." Those were her exact words. Word for word. How could you possibly know that? The massive arena had become completely silent except for Victoria's crying. Even the production crew stood frozen, understanding they were witnessing something far beyond typical television programming. "Because 3 weeks ago," Jonathan said gently, "Jesus gave me a message specifically for you. He said, 'Tell Victoria that her mother's cancer isn't a failure of her faith. It's an invitation to know me in a way prosperity theology could never teach her. Tell her I'm not angry about the false gospel she's been preaching. I'm heartbroken that it's left her empty when she needs me most. Tell her I've been waiting for this moment, when she would be willing to lose everything she's built on false promises so she could gain the one thing that actually matters, knowing me. Victoria looked up at Jonathan through her tears, her face a mixture of shock, grief, and something that looked almost like relief. Why would God send you to humiliate me publicly like this? Not to humiliate you, Victoria, Jonathan replied, his own tears flowing freely now. To set you free. You've been in prison for 20 years, a prison of your own theology that leaves no room for the reality of suffering. Your mother's cancer is breaking open that prison. And Jesus wants you to know that what's on the other side isn't failure or embarrassment, but the most authentic relationship with Him you've ever experienced. The megachurch pastor's wife sat broken on stage, her prosperity gospel shattered by a prophetic word she couldn't explain away. But Jonathan wasn't finished. What he was about to say next would force Victoria to make a choice that would determine not just her own destiny, but potentially the future of American Christianity itself. You need to see Victoria's response to this supernatural revelation. Keep watching, hit that like button if this is impacting you, and subscribe because this story is about to reach its most powerful moment yet. Joel Osteen had risen from his seat and now stood at the edge of the stage, visibly torn between protecting his wife and allowing something clearly supernatural to continue unfolding. The production director in the control booth frantically debated whether to cut the cameras, but something, perhaps divine intervention, kept them rolling. Jonathan remained kneeling beside Victoria, giving her space to process but staying close in supportive presence. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of heaven itself. Victoria, the Lord wants you to know something else. He said, for 20 years, Victoria has taught people to seek my hands instead of my face. She's told them to pursue my blessings instead of my presence. But I'm about to reveal myself to her in her mother's suffering, and she'll discover that knowing me, truly knowing me, is worth more than all the prosperity she's been promising. Victoria's sobbing intensified, her whole body shaking with the force of it. Several worship team members had tears streaming down their own faces as they watched their leader confronted with truth she'd been avoiding. He also said this, Jonathan continued, his voice breaking with emotion. He said, Victoria's mother is teaching her what Victoria failed to teach millions, that my grace is sufficient. Not my healing, not my prosperity, but my grace, my presence in the valley, my companionship in suffering. My love that doesn't depend on circumstances changing. I don't know how to do this, Victoria gasped between sobs. I don't know how to have faith that doesn't demand healing. I don't know how to trust God when He's not fixing everything. Everything I've taught, everything I've built, it all falls apart if faith doesn't guarantee blessings. The honesty was devastating and beautiful simultaneously. Here was a woman who had taught millions about faith, admitting she didn't know how to exercise faith when it didn't produce results. Jonathan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. That's because you've been teaching faith in outcomes rather than faith in a person, Victoria. You've taught people that faith is a tool for getting what they want from God. But biblical faith is trusting who God is regardless of what He does or doesn't do. It's saying with Job, though He slay me, yet will I trust Him. It's declaring with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, our God is able to deliver us, but even if He doesn't, we still won't bow. But that's so hard, Victoria whispered. That's so much harder than what I've been teaching. Yes, Jonathan agreed simply. Following Jesus is hard, Victoria. It's the narrow road that few find. It costs everything. But listen to what Jesus told me to tell you. The reason your mother has peace right now that you don't have, despite all your faith claims and positive confessions, is because she's finally stopped trying to use God and started simply being with God. She's discovered that His presence in suffering is more valuable than His deliverance from suffering. Victoria looked up at Jonathan with red, swollen eyes. What am I supposed to do with this? How do I stand up here next week and tell 16,000 people that everything I've taught them is wrong? How do I tell the millions watching online that prosperity gospel is false hope? It will destroy everything we've built. Maybe, Jonathan said gently, that's exactly what needs to happen. Maybe God is inviting you to be part of tearing down a false gospel so a true one can be built in its place. Maybe He's giving you the opportunity to lead millions out of deception rather than deeper into it. The weight of that possibility settled over the arena like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about Victoria's personal crisis, it was about the potential reformation of a movement that had led countless people astray with promises of prosperity that never materialized. Joel finally stepped fully onto the stage, his face reflecting his own internal struggle. "Jonathan," he said, his famous smile completely absent, "what you're saying? I mean, you're basically calling our entire ministry a lie." "No, Joel," Jonathan replied, standing to face him. "I'm saying your ministry has mixed truth with error in a way that makes the error more dangerous. You genuinely love people. Your hearts are in the right place. But you've built something massive on a faulty foundation, and Jesus is giving you both the opportunity to tear it down before it collapses and crushes the people trusting in it." Joel's hands were shaking now, the confident, ever-positive pastor showing vulnerability rarely seen. "You're talking about destroying a ministry that reaches 10 million people weekly, that funds humanitarian work around the world, that gives people hope when they have nowhere else to turn." "I'm talking about replacing false hope with real hope," Jonathan countered firmly. "False hope is cruel, Joel. It tells a cancer patient their faith will heal them, and when they die, their family is left not just with grief but with spiritual trauma, wondering if God abandoned them or if they failed God. Real hope tells that same patient, Jesus walks through this valley with you. His grace is sufficient. And whether he heals you in this life or the next, his love never fails." The confrontation had reached its apex, with America's most famous prosperity preachers forced to choose between protecting their empire or embracing a truth that would cost them everything. But what Victoria did next would shock everyone watching, including Jonathan himself. Don't click away now. Victoria's response in the next 60 seconds will either be remembered as the greatest act of courage in modern church history or the most tragic missed opportunity. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how this ends. Victoria stood slowly, her makeup ruined, her perfectly styled image destroyed, but something in her countenance had fundamentally shifted. She walked to center stage, no longer seeking Joel's approval or the audience's affirmation. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from crying but carried a strength that hadn't been there before. "I need to tell all of you something," she began, addressing the 16,000 people who had come expecting an encouraging message about claiming their blessings. "Jonathan just exposed the truth that I've been too afraid to face for months. And he's right. I've been wrong. For 20 years, I've been wrong." Gasps rippled through the congregation. Several staff members looked at each other in panic. This was their senior pastor's wife dismantling their entire theological foundation on live television, broadcast to millions. "Jesus doesn't promise you health, wealth, and prosperity," Victoria continued, each word seeming to cost her something. "He promises you a cross. He promises you persecution. He promises you that following him will cost you everything you have. And he promises that knowing him is worth it, not because of what you'll get, but because of who you'll know." The arena erupted in confused murmuring. Some people stood to leave, clearly unwilling to hear their comfort Christianity challenged. But most remained, transfixed by the raw authenticity of what they were witnessing. "My mother is dying," Victoria said, her voice breaking again. "And for months, I've been privately terrified because everything I've taught says that with enough faith, she should be healed. I've claimed it. I've confessed it. I've done everything our prosperity theology prescribes. But she's not getting better, and I've been lying awake at night wondering if I've wasted 20 years teaching people a gospel that doesn't work when it's really tested." Joel moved to his wife's side, placing an arm around her shoulders. His own eyes were filled with tears, his legendary composure completely shattered. "But 2 weeks ago," Victoria continued, "my mother said something that changed everything. She looked at me with more peace in her eyes than I've seen in years and said, 'Victoria, I spent decades claiming healing and blessing, always feeling like I was one confession away from breakthrough. But now that I've stopped demanding God fix everything and started just being with him in this valley, I've found the breakthrough I was always seeking. Knowing Jesus here in suffering is worth more than 1,000 days of the prosperity you've been preaching.'" The words hung in the air like a benediction. Several people throughout the arena began weeping, confronted with a truth their souls recognized even if their theology rejected it. "I didn't want to hear it," Victoria admitted. because it meant everything I'd built was on sand. But Jonathan's right. Jesus has been trying to teach me through my mother's cancer what I should have been teaching others all along, that His grace is sufficient. Not His healing, not His prosperity, but His grace. His presence in the valley. His love that doesn't depend on circumstances changing. She turned to look directly at Jonathan, who stood silently with tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being obedient to a word from God that you knew would make you extremely unpopular. Thank you for loving me and these people enough to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable." Then Victoria did something that would become one of the most viral moments in Christian media history. She dropped to her knees right there on the Lakewood Church stage, before 16,000 witnesses and millions watching online. "Jesus," she prayed aloud, her voice amplified through the arena sound system, "I've been teaching people to use you for blessings instead of teaching them to know you. I've made you into a means to an end instead of honoring you as the end itself. Forgive me. Strip away everything I've built on false promises and teach me, teach all of us, who you really are." The prayer was unscripted, raw, completely counter to everything Lakewood represented. And it was the most authentic moment that stage had ever witnessed. Jonathan knelt beside her, joined spontaneously by Joel, and then by dozens of people throughout the arena who had also fallen to their knees. "Father," Jonathan prayed softly, "thank you for Victoria's broken heart. Thank you for using suffering to reveal truth. Thank you for being patient with us while we've packaged you into something comfortable and marketable. Birth in us a hunger for the authentic gospel, the one that costs everything and is worth infinitely more." A tangible presence filled the stadium, something that felt ancient, holy, and utterly convicting. It wasn't the manufactured emotionalism of typical megachurch services, but something that made even the skeptics present sense they were in the presence of something real. Victoria remained on her knees for nearly 5 minutes, silent except for quiet weeping. But when she finally stood, her face was transformed in a way that cameras captured but couldn't fully convey. The polished prosperity preacher was gone. In her place stood a broken woman who had encountered the real Jesus, and it showed in every feature of her countenance. What Victoria announced next would send shockwaves through the entire prosperity gospel movement and spark a reformation that would change American Christianity forever. Stay watching to hear the decision that required more courage than anything she'd ever done before. Like this video if it's moving you, and subscribe because you need to see how this story ends. When Victoria stood, something fundamental had shifted not just in her demeanor but in the very atmosphere of the building. She took the microphone again, her voice steady despite the tears still flowing. "I need to make some announcements," she said, looking directly into the cameras. "Effective immediately, Joel and I are putting Lakewood through a complete theological revision. We're removing every prosperity gospel book from our bookstore. We're restructuring our teaching curriculum. We're going back to Scripture and building from the ground up on what Jesus actually taught, not what we wished He taught." The announcement sent shockwaves through the congregation and the watching world. Several prosperity gospel pastors watching the live stream immediately called their own staff meetings, panicking about what this meant for their ministries. "We're inviting Jonathan to lead a multi-week series here at Lakewood on authentic discipleship," Victoria continued. "On what it really costs to follow Jesus. On suffering and sacrifice and taking up your cross. On finding Jesus sufficient even when He doesn't give you what you want." Joel stepped forward to the microphone, his own voice thick with emotion. "I need to confess something too," he said, his trademark smile completely absent. "What Jonathan said earlier, about creating spiritual casualties. I've seen it. We all have. The emails from people whose faith was destroyed when the blessings we promised never came. The families torn apart by the guilt and shame of believing their suffering meant they lacked faith. We convinced ourselves we were giving people hope, but we were actually setting them up for devastating disillusionment." The honesty was stunning coming from America's smiling pastor. Several staff members were openly weeping, confronted with the weight of damage their theology had caused. "This will probably cost us," Joel continued. "People who come here for feel-good messages about claiming their blessings will leave. Our numbers will drop. Our influence will shrink. But maybe that's what Jesus meant when he said the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life. Jonathan approached the couple, embracing them both. "This is the beginning of something beautiful," he said. "It's going to be hard. You'll face criticism from the prosperity gospel world that sees you as traitors. You'll face mockery from skeptics who say you're just trying to save your reputation. But Jesus sees your hearts, and he's going to meet you in this journey in ways you can't imagine." Victoria nodded, wiping her eyes. "I want to say something to everyone watching this online," she said, looking directly at the camera. "If you've been hurt by prosperity teaching, if you claimed healing that never came, if you tithed faithfully expecting financial breakthrough that never materialized, if you've been carrying shame because suffering made you feel like a faith failure, I am so sorry. On behalf of everyone who's taught this false gospel, I am profoundly sorry for the spiritual damage we've caused." The apology resonated across the internet immediately. Within minutes, #LakewoodApology was trending as thousands of former prosperity gospel followers shared their stories of pain and spiritual trauma. "There's someone else I need to acknowledge," Victoria said, turning to where her mother was watching via video call from her hospital bed. The production team quickly displayed her mother's image on the massive screens flanking the stage. "Mom," Victoria said, her voice breaking, "you tried to tell me for years that something was missing from our teaching. You've spent your whole life in church but always felt like there was something deeper, something more real that we weren't accessing. And now, in the valley of death, you found it. You found what I've been teaching others about without actually possessing. Thank you for showing me that knowing Jesus is worth more than any blessing he might give." Her mother, frail but radiant with an otherworldly peace, smiled from the hospital bed. "I'm so proud of you, honey," she said weakly. What you're doing right now, this takes more courage than anything you've ever done. You're choosing truth over empire. You're choosing Jesus over success. That's the faith I always wished I could teach you." The moment was tender and heartbreaking and beautiful all at once. But the story was far from over. Victoria's transformation would spark a movement that would ripple through American Christianity for years to come, forcing countless other leaders to confront the same question. Are we preaching the real Jesus, or just a version we created to fill auditoriums? Keep watching to see the incredible aftermath of this moment, how one woman's courage to admit she was wrong triggered a reformation that changed millions of lives. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the final part of this story will leave you speechless. The footage went viral within hours. Victoria Osteen breakdown trended #1 globally on Twitter. News outlets from CNN to Fox News covered the story. Christian media exploded with commentary, some praising the honest confrontation with prosperity gospel, others condemning what they called the public humiliation of respected ministers. But the most significant response came from ordinary believers. Within 48 hours, over 10,000 people had shared their own stories in the comments. "I thought I was the only one who felt like a failure when the prosperity gospel didn't work for me. Thank you, Victoria, for admitting what so many of us have experienced. My church teaches the exact same thing Lakewood did. I'm leaving tomorrow to find authentic Christianity that doesn't promise what Jesus never promised. I spent years claiming healing for my son's disability, feeling guilty every day that my faith wasn't strong enough. This set me free from that toxic shame." 3 months later, Lakewood Church had transformed dramatically. Attendance had dropped by 35% as prosperity seekers left for more comfortable messages elsewhere. But those who remained experienced something they'd never encountered in years of attendance: genuine transformation. Small groups that once discussed breakthrough principles now studied Jesus's actual teachings about discipleship. The bookstore that once sold prosperity gospel bestsellers now featured theology classics, martyrs' testimonies, and cross-centered resources. Sermons addressed suffering, persecution, and the cost of following Jesus, topics previously avoided as too negative. Victoria authored a book titled "From Prosperity to the Cross: How My Mother's Death Taught Me the True Gospel." It became a phenomenon, reaching millions who had been disillusioned by prosperity promises that never materialized. "The prosperity gospel tells you that faith guarantees comfort," she wrote. "The true gospel tells you that faith guarantees Christ, and that he's worth infinitely more than any earthly comfort. My mother discovered this in her final months, and her gift to me was showing that the blessing isn't deliverance from the valley, but God's presence in the valley. Jonathan Roumie continued portraying Jesus in The Chosen, but his confrontation with prosperity theology had given him an unexpected platform. He traveled widely, teaching about the real Jesus, not the American version customized for comfort, but the biblical Christ who calls his followers to die to self and live for him. 1 year after the confrontation, Victoria stood before a very different Lakewood congregation, smaller in number but deeper in faith, and shared her testimony. A year ago, Jonathan Roumie walked onto this stage and God used him to shatter my comfortable theology, she said. At the time, I thought my world was ending. My mother has since passed away, and I experienced the very suffering I'd spent 20 years telling people faith would protect them from. She paused, tears flowing freely. But I also experienced something I never knew was possible. I experienced Jesus's presence in grief in a way prosperity preaching never taught me existed. I learned that Paul wasn't exaggerating when he said, "I count everything as loss compared to the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord." I discovered that the psalmist was speaking truth when he wrote, "Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you." The testimony resonated because it was real. Victoria had lost her mother, her prosperity theology, 35% of her congregation, and her reputation as a successful megachurch leader. But she'd gained something infinitely more valuable, an authentic relationship with Jesus that didn't depend on circumstances. "If I could go back and change things," Victoria concluded, "I wouldn't wish away my mother's cancer. Because God used it to save me from wasting the rest of my life teaching people a false gospel. He loved me too much to leave me in comfortable deception." Has this story challenged something in your heart? Have you been taught that following Jesus guarantees health, wealth, and earthly blessings? Perhaps, like Victoria, you've discovered that prosperity gospel can't answer life's deepest pains or explain suffering that no amount of positive confession can remove. The real Jesus doesn't promise you comfort. He promises you himself. And he's worth infinitely more than any blessing prosperity preachers offer. Jesus said, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me." That's not the message most megachurches preach. But it's the message that changed the world 2,000 years ago, and it's still changing lives today. If this message confronted something in your heart, if you're ready to pursue Jesus himself rather than just his blessings, comment "Jesus alone" below. Your response could encourage thousands of others to choose the narrow path of authentic discipleship. Subscribe for more content that confronts comfortable Christianity with biblical truth. We're living in an age of feel-good faith, but Jesus is calling his church back to the cross. Remember, prosperity gospel promises you everything and gives you nothing. The true gospel costs you everything and gives you Christ, and he's worth infinitely more.